Let's continue to think about this. I want, as a way of kind of a review and then pushing us forward, to think a little bit more about this relationship focus and contrasting a relational ministry of influence with a relational ministry of place sharing. And if we take this turn and go to a relational ministry of influence to place sharing as opposed to influence, we can contrast some things. So thinking about influence, thinking about place sharing, is that if we focus on influence, it really does, our ministries, I think, really become captured by the how question. How, like, for instance, how can we get young people to come? How can we get them engaged? How can we keep the church from declining? How can we make the budget? All that's good, but we can really get captured almost completely in the how. I think taking a turn towards place sharing frees us a little bit, or directs us at least to the who question. First and foremost, who is Jesus Christ for us? Who are we for each other? Who are these young people in our midst? Who are these young people in our neighborhood? That's a major, major change and difference. Bonhoeffer in his Christology lectures has this really overstated comment that only Bonhoeffer can overstate. But he says the question how is the question of the devil. The question who is the question of obedience. And what he basically means is that the how question, even good how questions, don't necessarily call you into following Jesus Christ. For instance, you can ask, how is Jesus both divine and human? You could solve that on a blackboard. That doesn't mean that it makes any difference in your life. But when this one encounters you and you have to say, who are you? That is a deeper, deeper impact. If we go to the biblical text, Jesus, even when Jesus uses the how question, he means something like the who. Isabel read the Mark 9 text, and one of my favorite elements of that Mark 9 text, the part she read, is phenomenal. But the other piece of it that you know that revolves around the transfiguration and the boy and the father who have been having a very bad experience. You know the story well. And we don't know a ton about this text, but it just feels like it should be a TV miniseries. Like, there's so much human pathos and drama around it. But we have this father, and he's got this boy, and we're not sure how long his boy has suffered from this, but it seems since childhood. I think he says since childhood. But what he's done to try to heal his boy, we don't know. But it's possible. It's possible that this is his last chance. He's been to every doctor, he's been to every healer, and he's losing his boy to the darkness, and things seem bleak. Maybe it's gotten so bad that no other child in the neighborhood will play with him. Things are just terrible for this boy. And the father hears of this healer in this God-forsaken land of Nazareth, and he grabs his boy, and maybe, we don't know this from the text, but maybe he walks for a day or two. And maybe every step he thinks to himself, this has got to work. This has got to work. I'm losing my boy to the nothingness. I'm losing my boy to this darkness. This has got to work. And again, maybe he walks 2 days, shows up to where Jesus is supposed to be, finds his disciples and says, I'm here to see Jesus. And then the tragic happens. The disciples turn to him and say, sorry about that. Jesus isn't here. Jesus is actually on vacation. He's on holiday. I'm sorry. And Jesus is taking his 3 best friends, Peter, James, and John. They've got a cooler full of cold beers. That's not in the text. And they head up a mountain to have a kind of bromance getaway. They get up on that mountain, they're having a good time, and things start getting very strange. A cloud descends upon the mountain, and all of a sudden, like in the movie Sixth Sense, they start seeing dead people. And there's Moses, and there's Elijah. And then Peter, who is the disciple who has a mouth that's shaped like a foot. In the Markan text, Peter interrupts the scene and says, Teacher, it is wonderful that we're here. Shall I build a shelter, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah? And in the text it says, he did not know what he was saying, which I think the Greek translation of that really is, super dumbass thing to say. I think that's what that actually means. And so Peter says his dumb thing. A voice comes from heaven that says, this is my son, listen to him. And bam, it's over. The clouds are gone, and Peter, James, and John and Jesus are just standing there, and Peter, James, and John are like, that was incredibly trippy. Well, down below, what's his father supposed to do? Here to see Jesus. Sorry, he's on holiday. All he can do is say, well, you've been with this Jesus. Do something. And they try. And tragically, it doesn't work. And now chaos has encapsulated the situation, and just in the middle of the chaos, Jesus walks back in. And Jesus has some harsh words to say to the disciples, but then Jesus says a profound question that in English is encapsulated in a how question, but it's really a who question. He turns to the Father and he says, how long? How long has your boy been like this? Now, when I say the how question, I mean is we even hear that in a kind of technical how question. Because we live in a diagnostic culture, we think that's a diagnostic question. Like when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, how long has your elbow felt that way? How long has the rash been there? Or you take your computer into the IT and they say, how long has it been since the hard drive fired up? We think it's a diagnostic question. But there's no other correlation of Jesus asking diagnostic questions anywhere else in his miracles. It's not a how question. How can we figure this out? It's a who question. He invites the Father to narrate his experience, to reveal who he is. How long has your boy been like this? Is this deep invitation to share in his life. And the Father, what does he say? Long enough, essentially, he says, long enough for it to be killing me. Long enough for being a burden I'm not sure I can get up from. But in the midst of that who question of revealing his story, the Father finds just enough hope, almost not even able to lift his eyes from the ground. And he says, but teacher, if you are able. And Jesus stops him and says, if I am able, I was just up on a mountain with Moses and Elijah. And then he says, all things are possible for those who believe. And then we get that incredibly profound statement of New Testament faith that's born out of the who. I believe, help my unbelief. I'm the who does not believe. And Jesus is saying, I'm the who will believe for you. And I think the transition to think about this as place sharing is to allow the who question to direct us. And it starts with a primarily theological one. Who is Jesus Christ? Who will always lead us to ask, who is our neighbor? Who is this one that we're called to? So taking this transition, I think, is a big move for us. Now, the other way to look at this, and I'm going to show you a video that illustrates this, is if you've heard me say the name Bonhoeffer quite often, probably the book that Bonhoeffer is most famously known for is a book called Discipleship, or The Cost of Discipleship. And what's famous about that book, the reason it's actually called The Cost of Discipleship is because when it was in German, it's just Nachfolge, which means follow. That was its title. And when the British decided to translate it, long after Bonhoeffer's death, they felt like you can't sell a book that's called Follow. So they decided to call it The Cost of Discipleship, because one of the most interesting themes is when Dietrich contrasts costly grace and cheap grace. And at least in my part of the world, students love to talk about cheap grace and costly grace, rarely ever knowing what those two things actually refer to. But it's very interesting. This is what Bonhoeffer says cheap grace is. Cheap grace is grace as a concept. Cheap grace is grace as a program. Cheap grace, and now we're upping the ante, is grace as a doctrine. That's cheap. Ultimately, cheap grace is when grace becomes an idea, a concept. There's only one thing that is costly grace, and costly grace is the person of Jesus Christ who calls you to follow. And what's really, I think, fascinating about that we can think about in our ministries is that ideas don't necessarily encapsulate the kind of transformation that happens in the encounter with a person. That personhood becomes the place where God comes near to us. And I think there's a real issue in our Western world is that we like to freeze things in ideas, even in ideologies. But the Christian faith is really about encounter with persons. The person of Jesus Christ, the person of God the Father, the person of one another. So you can see the difference between the idea and the person. It's very easy to boo him when it's just an idea, when he's kind of totalized as an idea. But when you actually encounter the person, it's quite different. And I worry about that in our churches that are feeling decline, that we turn young people into an idea. and then we know all sorts of things that are wrong with them, all sorts of ways they need to change. But when you actually encounter the who, it's quite different. And I think the Christian life is really about, the depth of the Christian story really isn't about encounter with a who, more than it is an idea. Christianity really isn't an idea. It's an encounter with the personhood of Jesus Christ, who is the fullness of God. And I think we can really move into that in the context of our ministries. So it's contrasting the how and the who. If we practice relational ministry as influence, then it tends to be about programs. What kind of things can we do to get them to come? Well, our church, it's not really great because we don't really have a youth program. Our Sunday school is kind of down to nothing. And how can we influence kids to actually build this program? But if we think of place sharing, it moves beyond that. And it's really not about you, whether you're a volunteer, being a programmer, but actually being a theologian. Now, what I mean by theologian doesn't necessarily mean that you spend all your downtime just reading Calvin's Institutes, Like a kid says, can I have coffee? And you say, yes, after I'm done reading part 4. Maybe, that would be great if you did that. But it really means asking this big question of, what is God calling you to? Where is Jesus Christ in your life? What's the Spirit want for you? Helping them discern the workings of God, I think, becomes a much different kind of perspective that moves us. Third thing is that when it becomes about influence, it becomes about cultural conflict. And I guess another way to think about that is it becomes about upending decline. How can we, in a culture that is pulling young people in so many directions, how can we get some market share? How can we actually get some market share in this? As opposed to thinking about it in place sharing, that it's about helping them recognize, live into, read their lives next to this story of the one who's been incarnate, crucified, and resurrected. And that what we're really inviting them into is seeing reality, seeing their own lives inside of this story. And that takes a little bit of a different kind of disposition than just trying to make a case that church is fun too. No, there's something deeper here in this story, this way of life, this sense of we think what a good life actually is, that we read and understand through this narrative of the one who's been incarnate, crucified, and resurrected. Now, this pushes us to ask a big question, and especially as we kind of come to the end of the direct content that I'm sharing with you, which is really what is the shape of faithful place sharing? Or another way to look at this is, okay, so if I am slightly convinced by your point, how do I live this out? Particularly, how do I live this out in my own life? Well, there's 4 things just big things that will probably launch us into further conversation that I want to share with you. And I think that the shape of faithful place sharing, first of all, has this of the 4 elements, is that it's both open and it's closed. That it's both open and closed. I think there's a real illusion in doing ministry, particularly with teenagers, and particularly relational ministry, where we think the objective is to be constantly open to young people. Let them call you at any time at night. Pick them up whenever they ask for a ride. Just always be there for them. And that seems right, but I'm not so sure. I think it actually takes being open to them, of course, taking their phone calls, talking to them about things, being there with them, having coffee with them. But just as importantly, and this seems counterintuitive, just as importantly is being closed. Bonhoeffer says in Life Together, he's talking about a community. He says, be wary of the person who cannot be with others. Be wary of the person who cannot be with others. Well, this is a book about community. That makes all sorts of sense. But it's the second clause that's the most interesting. He says, be just as wary. Maybe even more so, be just as wary of the person who cannot be alone. Be just as wary of the person who cannot be alone. You cannot have community without openness, obviously, but you also need closeness. People need to be free. You are not a good pastor in relationship. You are not a good youth worker. You're not a good relational youth worker if you're enmeshed with anyone. What young people need is actually human beings to be in relationship with. When I was doing that ministry where I took Scott to camp, a few months before that, I just had started, and the person that I was working under invited me over to his house for dinner, a way of us to kind of kick off our ministry together. And I got there, and I kind of had the feel that he didn't tell his wife that I was coming over for dinner, and that she, at the last minute, was preparing a meal. And like I said, I was in my early 20s and lacked manners in so many ways. So we got there, and they gave me a Coke, and I was drinking it as they were preparing the meal. And about 10, 15 minutes in, the doorbell rang, and my ministry partner went to the door and disappeared. And I was sitting there awkwardly and watching his wife prepare the meal. I was too young and stupid to say, "Can I help you with something?" I just sat there awkwardly and watched. Well, we then transitioned into dinner, and she had made a salad and some pasta, and we started with the salad. And still my ministry partner, we're now at 20 minutes, hadn't come back. So I'm trying all the small talk that I have. She has 2 small children. She had to prepare a second meal for them because they wouldn't eat the pasta. So she had made a couple hot dogs. Now they had ketchup out and they had it all over themselves. She looked exhausted. We finish the salad, we go to the pasta, and we're eating it. Now it's just pretty much silence. Finally, the ice cream goes on the table for dessert, and I can't take it anymore. And I say, "So, where's your husband? Where's my ministry partner?" And her shoulders go down, and she slouches, and she says, "Oh, I'm sure the guys stopped by." And I'm thinking, the guys? Like, why didn't anyone tell me when I inquired about this job that this guy was involved with the mob? Like, who are the guys that came over? Like, what's going on? So I think I said it like that. I was like, "The guys?" And then she said, "Oh, yeah. The guys from his Bible study. They stop over 3 or 4 times a week." And it just so happened that they would stop over, he'd leave his family, and he'd go hang out with them in the driveway as they skateboarded for hours on end. So we were just finishing the dessert, and he walked back in. And I hadn't had all that information at the beginning, so I asked him at the time. And so when he walked in, I said to him, "Is everything okay?" I mean, I figured someone had to be suicidal or some kind of crisis, that he would be out there the whole time. And I said to him, and I'm in the ministry now, I said, "Is everything okay?" And he looked at me kind of confused. And then it clicked, and he realized this was a moment I can teach him something. And he said, "Oh yeah, things are fine. But that's relational ministry for you. It's not 9 to 5. And I looked at his wife, who was utterly exhausted. And I thought, is this right? And I think actually what my ministry partner did that day, and almost every day that he went out and spent his evening with these kids, not only hurt his own family, but actually wasn't good for the young people. That basically what he communicated to those young people who would come by 4 or 5 days a week because they were bored, is he communicated to them not that he was a human being, but that he was a jungle gym. And when they were bored, they'd come over and hang out with him. If he would have just even once in a while went to the door and said, "Hey guys, thanks for stopping by. So great to see you, but I'm exhausted." Or, "Hey, my wife and I are just going to have a glass of wine together," or, "I got to give my daughter a bath," or, I'm just on holiday." If he would have said that to them, he would have given those kids an incredible gift. He would have communicated to them that they are in a relationship with a human being who has other responsibilities and other people that he's committed to, that they would have been invited into that depth of relationship. I told the group yesterday that at least in my country, I'm not so sure young people need another adult with a task to be in their life, particularly not middle-class young people. They have golf swing coaches, they have test prep tutors, they have all sorts of people in their lives telling them how they can get to where they need to go. But what they desperately need are human beings that invite them into their lives, to be who's with them. And sometimes that means being closed, saying no, saying, "Hey, I know this is really hard. I know you just broke up with him. I know you were going out for 32 hours. But could you call me not at 2 a.m. in the morning?" Again, that doesn't say, "I don't care about you." It actually says, "I care about you so much." This is human person to human person. This is us in relationship. So almost counterintuitively, relationships demand openness, of course, but they also demand closeness. Tell a lot of church leaders, when it comes to actually, if you have the resources to hire a professional youth worker, ask the question, figure out if they can be open to young people. But probably more importantly, ask them how they're closed. How do they get away? How do they differentiate? How do they invite other people into the ministry and they just don't do it themselves? The open and close, I think, is really important. Second point is it's about barrier or confrontation. The great gift we give in relationship is that we know ourselves in and through relationships. There's no way for us to even know ourselves outside of it. We need someone to be in conversation with. And that does mean that sometimes it leads to confrontation. It sometimes even leads to judgment. It was a great comment at the beginning. You can never get to a relationship through judgment. Can't see someone from across the room, have them come up to you and say, hey, I've been noticing that your wardrobe is really awful. Now that I'm standing next to you, whew, you have terrible coffee breath. You're not thinking, hey, we should be friends. You're not thinking that. But once you have a relationship, judgment is part of it. And judgment actually says that this is a relationship that can transform. For instance, my wife judges me all the time inside the relationship. She says, you know, you do talk more than you listen. Or when you said it that way, it made me feel really small. And that's a judgment, but it's not a judgment that ends the relationship. It's actually a judgment that deepens the relationship. And so I think we need, in place sharing, there's mutual judgment that happens. We do sometimes say to young people, what's going on here? Tell me why this makes sense to you. Tell me why you're making these decisions. But we also should be ready for them to say it back. There's mutual judgment too. To be in a relationship with place sharing with a high school kid and saying, you know, my family's so important for me. If you're really in a relationship, sometimes they're going to say, oh, really? Well, you sure seem to travel a lot for someone who thinks their family is so important. And that's what relationships are. There's mutual judgment here. And this becomes about our own faith formation as much as young people's in the context of this relationship. Now, to illustrate that, let me show you a much shorter video clip. And this comes from the movie, what's the movie called? Freedom Writers, that's it. The movie Freedom Writers, which is about a woman who's taken over a out-of-control classroom and gotten them to rework their lives by writing their stories, which is really interesting. But one of the students is named Andre, and Andre has decided to no longer come to class. Well, finally, after a few weeks, he stumbles back into class, and watch Miss G, who's the teacher, watch how she confronts him. Watch how she loves him. And it's a pretty hard confrontation, but it leads to transformation. I mean, the first thing that she does in the confrontation, which leads us into the third point, is she corresponds with his reality. She sees him and she says, Andre, I heard about your brother. The thing that makes judgment so incredibly painful is that when it never corresponds with our reality. And someone judges us and we feel like, you don't know me. You don't know what my story is. But when someone speaks into our life, even a hard word into our life, when they have corresponded to our reality, it's an incredible thing. And when she looks at him and she confronts him, she says, I heard about your brother. Is that why you gave yourself an F? And then she just confronts him. I know who you are. I can see you. And I think in many ways what confrontation does, what judgment even can do is, if it's corresponded to reality, is I see you. You matter. I see what you're doing. And I think the place share sometimes does confront. Does say, what's going on? Why have you disappeared? The place share knows that someone has disappeared, which so often, at least in American churches, as kids disappear, and we think, well, out of sight, out of mind. The place share chases them down and asks, what's going on? Where have you been? And that's not to bring condemnation. It's actually to bring us into communion. But you can't do judgment without corresponding to reality. But I think there's a lot of, at least kids in my country, who would love to be confronted and even judged in a certain way. I mean, that's a harsh word we use, but would love to be confronted because then they've been seen and they feel like they're disappearing. Why aren't adults saying anything? So many young people will write memoirs and things about drug addiction or something later in their lives, and they say, my uncle had to know. My people in my church had to know, but no one ever said anything. So this being seen becomes a huge piece of it. And it really frames Andre's identity. But it has to correspond to reality. So I want to show you my favorite video clip. And my favorite video clip that will illustrate even further corresponding reality and maybe help us think about what this looks like in practice comes from the British movie. I was telling Susie, it's so sad that film clips get older because some of them are so great, but this is still a great one. This comes from the comedy About a Boy. Do you know the movie About a Boy? So in this movie, we have Hugh Grant, who plays Will. And Hugh Grant's character, Will, is probably the most self-centered, selfish person who has ever existed in the world. He's inherited money from his father, royalties, and he just doesn't want to do anything but enjoy his life. To such an extent that he had a realization that single mothers are actually, as he says, easier to shag. So he made up having a child so he could join a single mother's support group. Well, while he was there, he met a woman. They went out on a date, and to his disappointment, this woman brought along a kid who was probably 12, 13, named Marcus. Marcus is an odd 12 or 13-year-old, but he was along on the date because Marcus's own mother was feeling blue. She suffers from some pretty severe depression. Well, to their shock, they take Marcus home, drop him off at his flat, and find that his mother has attempted suicide. Luckily, they get her to the hospital and she's okay. But you can imagine if you're 12 or 13, this throws you for a major loop. So every day after school, Marcus shows up at Will's flat to spend time. So here you have this kid, and shows up at this guy's house. And Will at first is very, very reluctant to let him into his life. But he eventually does. And you see that first day, after watching Countdown with him, he just shakes his hand and says, oh, see you later then. And Will's kind of surprised, like, I thought this kid was going to squat in my life forevermore. But then they just have this time of spending time together. What's the point? There's no other point. They're just together. But eventually in being together and sharing in each other's lives and doing something utterly mundane, like just watching, I don't know, maybe you're a fan. It seems like a kind of lame British game show. Eventually you have an event of the encounter of persons. Where what does Will do? Marcus says, I think Will would have rather been watching Xena Warrior Princess, but he decided he better ask me a question. How are things at home then? No, nothing like that. Well, then that's still bothering you then. And then we get inside of Will's consciousness. It's still bothering me. It's a nightmare. Imagine going home every day, putting your hand on the doorknob and turning it and walking in and wondering if your mother is laying on the floor dead. That's why I come here instead of going home after school. He has his confession to himself. But he says verbally out loud, bit, when I think about it. And what is Will's response? He looks at him and says, effing hell. It's not vulgar. It's naming the situation. It's like Luther says a theologian, the cross does, calls a thing what it is. It must be hell to go home and do that. And yet that vulgar word, which I do want to write my next book, is youth ministry as effing hell. Wouldn't that be good? You could go in so many different directions. But that word it's a vulgar word, but it also manifests within it deep hope. And we see it in the look. And we hear Marcus say when he walks home, I don't know why Will swore like that, but it made me feel better. It made me feel like I wasn't so pathetic for getting so scared. There's an utter beauty in corresponding to someone's reality, inviting them to narrate that reality, and then giving a word of proclamation to it. The only honest word of proclamation to Marcus's situation is that must be hell. That must be hell. And so Will joins Marcus in hell at the cross. But there becomes an incredible paradox of faith in that moment, is when Will names hell, it becomes the first seed, the first light, the first movement of new hope and new possibility. Because now Marcus is not alone in that. He has been joined. His place has been shared. And so corresponding to reality becomes a big piece of it. But it starts not by you creating a program and sitting kids down and saying, okay, now tell me what's wrong with you and so that I can be there. It comes in the utterly mundane. Just sharing enough time together, doing something, changing the oil on cars, moving the tables around for Sunday school, maybe getting the coffee ready. And it could take years. It could take 4 or 5 years. But eventually in that, there's something that's happening in just that time spent. But eventually there becomes this moment where we care for one another, where we share deeply in one another's lives. You have boundary issues and things to worry about, but you just wonder if everyone in our churches simply invited a young person like Marcus into their life and simply was there. Will was not formally trained to do this, but sharing in Marcus's humanity, eventually the question came, what's going on with you? And he responded as honestly as he could. He probably needs a pastor. He probably needs a youth worker to be able to debrief. I mean, you hear Will say, next time Marcus needs to talk to somebody, he can find a therapist or a counselor, because clearly I had no idea what I was doing. He should find anyone who can find something more than an obscenity, not realizing that his very word was the word of truth, the word that the gospel needed, that word that brought forth the gospel. And so we always need others that we can talk to. Say, I need help with this. Can you help me understand what's going on with this kid? Can you be there with me as I stand with this young person? But the incredible transformation of just being there and naming a reality. Last point that wraps things up for us is that that is about mutuality and freedom. And what I mainly mean by this is that we do have an illusion, especially if this is about a relational ministry of influence, that like converts like, that like attracts like. So you need young people to attract young people. You need extroverts. Only extroverts should be involved with adolescents. And I just fundamentally don't believe that's true. I think in the context of this kind of play sharing, there is freedom for you to be you. There's actually freedom for you to be who you are. And you can't be too old, or you can't be too young. You can't have too much energy or too little. You can't be too much of an extrovert or too much of an introvert. There is the freedom for you to be who you are, because what young people need is a relationship with a human being. That Jesus Christ comes to us in the communion of persons in relationship. So there's freedom in it. It also means that the objective is not to get young people to open up to us. At least in my country, we tend to assume the good youth worker is the one who can get young people to open up. So we usually carpet bomb them with questions when we see them. Hey, how's football? How's this? How's your girlfriend? How's that? How's that? And trying to get them to open up. And if you've ever had a conversation with a 13, 14, 15-year-old boy, you know that neurologically the only response can be fine, no, maybe, is about all that they can say. But I don't think that's the real push. The onus isn't on them opening their lives up to us necessarily, as much as about us opening our lives up to them. So inviting them close enough that we tell our stories, that they watch us as we deal with things. And there's been research done of kids saying the most powerful faith formation moment was when my mentor invited me into when his family had to put their dog down. I mean, this sense of watching someone else, another adult particularly, live their life and live their Christian life out in these ordinary moments became incredibly transformational. So there's deep freedom in here. And the great move of Protestant theological commitment is there's always the freedom of the Christian. There's always freedom in the midst of this. And the freedom is that you are free to be you. You are free to be a human being. And what young people need is to be in relationship with you, with people in your congregation. So you never don't, to use a double negative, you never lack the resources to do ministry with young people. Just like I started, you never lack young people. All of us in this room have connection with a lot of different young people. And in many ways, you are already what you need to be. And of course, that's scary, because it means you actually have to be a human being and can't hide behind the role of Sunday school teacher or pastor, but you have to be honest, as open and closed as a barrier and corresponding to reality, to live into that freedom. Let me pray for us. God, I'm deeply thankful for the people in this room and the people who are watching and listening across Scotland. Pray for each and every one of them, but even more so the young people that are connected to them, the young people that they love, the young people who come in and out of their lives. I pray, God, that as we continue to talk today and then finish and leave and log off, that these people would have one clear word from you. And that word is that you are well pleased. That you are well pleased with their faithfulness. That you will see it through. And that they will most indeed be a blessing to young people of the church. And most fully will experience the depth of the gospel. Thanks for this day together. Amen.